So it is a bit of a complicated topic, standards, essential patents, and open standards. So in order to structure the conversation, we thought of a way of dividing it into three sections or chunks. So first, starting with some big picture thoughts from Patrick McCutcheon, who's the managing director of IP Europe, and then three blocks of topics from the overall impact of the Commission's SEPS proposal, then the impact specifically on open standards development, and then the impact of specific provisions, starting with the forest and then going towards the trees over the course of the next 90 minutes. So I'll just introduce each person as they begin talking, but starting with the IP Europe board, we've got Patrick McCutcheon, who's the managing director. We've got Colette Ronsley, who is the chair, and we've got Patrick Hufkens, who is a member of the board. And then around the table, we have others you can see. We have Christian Loyot from ETSI, who is Legal Affairs and Governance Director. We've got Christer Hammerland, whose name tag is hopefully coming back from the European Commission, Cybersecurity and Defense Officer. We have Ashoka Ganesh from Sensenelec with us here. Gregor Langus is here. We've got from Cornerstone Research, Axel Ferracini from 4IAP Council. Hopefully Ines de Matos Pinto will join us from the Parliament, and then Emil Zheng from Huawei was also invited. And Dirk Weiler, yeah. Sorry, I missed Dirk from Nokia. So without further ado, I would invite Patrick McCutcheon to say some opening remarks, and then we will go over to questions.
Thank you, Brandon. Let me first say who IP Europe are. We are an association of organizations and companies that massively invest in R&D. When I say massive, I mean about 15.
It just needs to be a little bit closer.
Can you hear me now?
Is it better?
Okay.
Nobody told us.
Where do they plug in?
Good question.
I'll need to wear headphones.
And there's a little socket on the side.
This as well.
Roundtable specifically, but it should be for the people in the audience.
But they gave them to us. Yeah.
Okay, no, it should be good.
Oh. Could somebody who's already got a headset give a hand signal if they can hear? Okay, then I continue. Thank you, Brandon.
Well, maybe give it a minute so everybody's got them.
Do you want to say a few more words, Brandon? Because it sounds like they didn't hear you.
So I understand this does work a lot better if you have the if the headsets. Can I see a show of hands? Everybody here is okay over there? Yeah. Okay, great. So you've probably missed most of the introduction, but I think we've got name tags, and you've seen online the people who are participating in the roundtable. So I won't go through the introductions again, other than Patrick McCutcheon, who's the managing director of IP Europe. I just ask to say a few opening remarks, and then we'll go on to Q&A.
Thank you, Brandon. Well, first of all, who are IP Europe? We are an association of organizations, research organizations and companies that massively invest in R&D. And when I say massively, I mean investment of the order of 15 to 20% of turnover. This is investment that goes into the development of critical technologies, which are then contributed to the development of open standards, which facilitate a rapid diffusion of the technology. And to give an example, in cellular technology, we've had fast rate of innovation and a great rate of diffusion, with perhaps more devices on the planet than there are human beings. The success of this is perhaps at threat due to the recent Commission proposal to regulate standard essential patents and specifically the conditions for licensing them. This is a space that is already subject of much regulatory provisions. We have jurisprudence from the Court of Justice outlining when it's feasible, when it's permissible to enforce patents by seeking an injunction. There are antitrust rules. There is the contract law commitment to license the patents under fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. And there is IP law, which has to be applied with proportionality. Nevertheless, the Commission has decided to intervene in this space with a regulation that others will provide details on. It comes after a period of time following a policy statement 5.5 years ago, during which they've carried out a lot of studies. I will merely say that they have not really taken account of the studies in developing their proposal. Indeed, the studies underpinning their impact assessment do not justify the proposal. The last point on the behavior of the Commission is that it has actually not consulted with the stakeholders affected by the proposal in the sense of sharing its ideas with them to test their practicability. The Commission proposal, in a few words, is relatively unbalanced. The Commission even admits this itself in its impact assessment, where it says quite plainly the costs of this regulation fall on one side of the market and the benefits accrue to the other. It comprises a series of obligations, in fact 4 distinct obligations, which fall on the SEP holders before they can enforce their patents. And this is critical because the one actual problem in the marketplace is one of strategic infringement or holdout, where certain implementers decide to delay the negotiation process and ultimately the payment of royalties. This regulation, if implemented, would extend the negotiation period by anything up to 3 or 4 years. The proposal outlines 4 steps, one of which has a timeline, 3 of which don't. So if we would assume that 9 months is the time taken for each of these, we're talking about an additional 3-year period of delay on top of an already lengthy delay before patents can be enforced. The impact of this would not only be on the incentives of my members to invest in R&D. Well, they could still invest in R&D, but they might not share the technology and open standards development. The bigger threat is to the innovation ecosystem, and I spent many years in the European Commission promoting open innovation. If the open innovation ecosystem is threatened, then technology leadership will be in the hands of big tech and large vertically integrated companies, of which the EU has few, if any. This would not enhance European technology sovereignty. It might enhance the technology sovereignty of others, but not of Europe. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank Patrick for that introduction, and without further ado, I think we would just start going into questions. And as I said in the opening plenary, we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. If anybody in the back section wants to ask questions, just raise your hand, and we'll find a way to get you to a microphone, or just come sit at one of the empty spots here and talk. So I would like to start with the first block that I mentioned about the overall impact. Patrick has given a bit of an introduction, but I'd just like to ask the other companies concerned, who are IP Europe members, then how they feel about the overall impact of the Commission proposal. Maybe also on the aspect of transparency, which it said was the reason for doing this. Colette?
Well, maybe I'll take that off. Maybe I'll make a start then. So as Brandon said, I am chair of IP Europe, but I'm also the head of IP policy and advocacy at Nokia Technologies, one of 2 of the largest contributors to open standards development. And we also invest very heavily in R&D. So to put some figures to what Patrick was saying, As Nokia, we have invested more than 140 billion euros in R&D since 2000. That's 4.5 billion euros a year, and that is 20% of our revenues that we invest in R&D. And we have been at the forefront of open standards development, contributing our technologies to 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and today we're on the precipice of 6G and determining our 6G strategy. And one of the key concerns that I have is about this package is the implications for our ability to continue to invest in R&D and contribute to open standards at the same level, if not more, than we have done historically. And whether or not, given that we are so dependent on our licensing revenues in order to invest at that level, that actually we may look to invest our R&D resources elsewhere. To discuss the package and pick up some of the threads, and I'm sure many of you in this room have already heard about it, perhaps I can drill down into a couple of aspects. As a company, Nokia was very keen to hear of this initiative by the European Commission, that they were looking to increase licensing efficiency, to introduce transparency and a fair system for SCP licensing. And again, as a company, we're not only a large SEP holder and licensor, but we are also a licensee when it comes to our network infrastructure business. And therefore, we are really looking for balanced positions. But unfortunately, that's not what we currently see in this package. What we see are a series of measures that are unclear. And I've got teams of experts within Nokia looking at these provisions. In my mind, they're not making licensing more likely or more efficient. They don't seem to be addressing this concern of patent holdout. In fact, there is one provision in the draft regulation which introduces a conciliation process, which is a conciliation where you would not be able to seek redress before the courts in Europe unless you go through this mechanism that is intended, as I understand it, to be over in a period of 9 months. But if that doesn't bind an implementer at the end of the process, somebody who's using the technologies, it doesn't change or encourage or incentivize them to take a license. All it means is that we have been delayed access to the ability to enforce our patent rights and to monetize our IP. And as I said, this is revenue that we then reinvest for future technologies. So that's my kind of starter for 10 on the package.
I can feel you're just getting warmed up as well. How about we go then to Patrick, if there's anything in terms of general overview that hasn't been mentioned already yet?
Yeah, so in terms of numbers and activities, it's a very similar story to Nokia's story for Ericsson. So if you want to do telecom, you need standards. Without standards, you have walkie-talkies, you don't have telecom networks. So standards are essential to our businesses. We invest massively. The numbers are very comparable to Nokia, so we're almost Nordic twins in that sense, and working really on networks as well. So that to just picture the background. When we're looking at the regulation, 2-3 things come to mind. First, surprise. Patrick McCutcheon already mentioned the studies that have been done by external parties, commissioned by the Commission, and that actually have led to conclusions that are hesitant at best. Actually, conclusions saying there is nothing that warrants intervention at this moment because we don't see massive opt-out, not of those who contribute to the standards, not of those who use the standards. So standards are still being used, still being deployed. So there is nothing that warrants intervention at this moment or that points at real problems. Yet what the Commission has done is massive. It's really massive. The intervention in this field is very profound. So there are many different elements that have been introduced, as Colette has said, but they really impact it, and they do it in a way that we have never seen in this industry before. So cellular standardization exists around about 40 years, has been marked by two things. One, massive deployment and success. So we grow that market from 0 to today 5.5 billion users in less than 30 years. So not other technology in the world has ever been deployed so quickly. So massive success, but very cautious, step by step, looking at how we can improve the system step by step. What the Commission does now is departing from that. It's really a radical change, not step by step, hoping that everything will go well. And then there's the second point I want to make, with a very unclear scope. So the scope of this regulation is worldwide. So it's standardization, it's the European patents that read on standards, but standards that can be created worldwide. So in other words, if you have a Korean standard that has a European patent, that would fall under this regulation, that patent. So it's extremely broad. It's really very, very broad. And to do all that, they have given that task to look at registration, essentiality, FRAND determination, and aggregate royalty setting to an institution that has no prior experience with patents. So the EU IPO, as we know in Alicante, has a lot of experience with trademarks, has no experience with patents. And so you have massive change, radical change, to a whole new entity, indicating that that entity will run with 10 FTEs to do all that work. And that's immediately a very big concern of ours. You know, we're all for improving the system, for getting better transparency. But better transparency you can only do with quality. Quality you cannot do with 10 people. At the startup phase it's 30 people, but you know, longer term 10 people. When you have all these enormous tasks ahead of you, you can outsource these tasks, but then you're not looking at quality. If you really want to have a qualitative system, you need to build up seriously. And so that's our biggest concern, that if we really want to improve transparency, if we really want to lead the world in terms of regulation, then you need to put the right budget, you need to put the right time, and you need to give the people the time to grow into a qualitative system. And we don't see that in the current regulation. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. I understand Colette wants to say something else before we...
Yes. Sorry. What I wanted to do was pick up on a couple of comments that Patrick made, because we, as industry players, do look to improve the system. There have been developments. We have seen innovative ways of trying to license. We've seen the development of patent pools across a variety of industry sectors. But if you were to just take one of the pillars of this, so we're talking about a registration system, then a system of checking patents essentiality, and then we're talking about a mechanism for conciliation, a global FRAND rate determination, but led from European patents, and an aggregate royalty setting mechanism. Each one of those aspects is a huge endeavor. And again, the EU IPO doesn't have previous experience in that. Not necessarily the be-all and end-all of it, but the way that I've been looking at the impact assessment, and obviously during the Commission's process, changes were made to the draft regulation, but what hasn't changed is the budget and the resourcing that I see the EU IPO being allocated. And yet when the package was announced, it became very clear from what Commissioner Breton was saying that that budget is really all about certain aspects of it, what would be done in-house, but so much of it is intended to be outsourced to experts. And to quote Commissioner Breton, that expertise is rare and expensive, and I just don't know where this expertise will come from. And the timing of this is also curious. I say that because we have spent a long, long time, decades, coming up with the UPC. And we're just on the brink of the UPC coming into effect. And the UPC has its own arbitration and mediation centre, and yet we're setting up a system in the EU IPO, which means that either the UPC will not be used, certainly for standard essential patents, but there may actually be a drain of the expertise that's been put in the UPC just to facilitate what's been done or what's anticipated will be done in the EU IPO. And again, my concern, like Patrick's, is if you are going to do something and you want it to support efficient and effective licensing, you need to ensure that the system is working at the get-go, that it cannot be prone to delays, that it's properly resourced in terms of both funding and people and expertise. And as much of that expertise should be vested in the body itself, not on external resource, especially in an area where there is little external resource and potential conflict risks. And so I look at the budget and it sounds like quite a high figure, 2 million euros a year, but then I look at our own internal resources dedicated to certain aspects of this and think, well, hang on a minute, there's all of these companies that are going to want this. This is woefully underestimating what would be needed to have a system that's functional, let alone best in class. And therefore, I'm concerned that this 9-month aspiration for conciliation is just that, aspirational. That registration, which is necessary in order to even be able to license your technology, that will be at risk of delay because the whole process is dependent on being established. And I appreciate the EU IPO has developed databases before, but standard essential patents are technical. The information is relatively technical. And then we have this system of essentiality checking. And again, there was a change during the process between drafts that were leaked in the public domain and the final version, which increased the number of essentiality checks and who could request essentiality checks. But there was no increase in budget. There was no increase, there was no looking back at the impact assessment and going, well, if industry is going to be paying for this, what is the impact? And just looking at the impact assessment, and I'm sure Patrick Hopkins read it too, it certainly seems to me from a couple of the footnotes that a significant amount of the costs of this system will not only fall on industry, but fall on two companies in industry, our companies, at a time when really we're looking at things where we have relatively low margin businesses when it comes to our other areas, and we really are dependent on our licensing technologies.
Thank you, Colette. I mean, you could argue that this is bad enough if it affects two European champions on the tech phase stage, but I think that there are also bigger implications. I'd actually like to ask an economist in the room what he thinks this means in terms of the EU's overarching goal of increasing technological sovereignty and digital innovation. Is this going to help that or hinder it, do you think? Gregor?
Yeah, well, perhaps that's a better question to ask a political scientist or someone who works with the geopolitical issues. I don't see how this particular act can do much in terms of increasing Europeans' tech sovereignty. And that's, you know, in one way, that's because there's a lot of verticals in this sphere that are outside of Europe, in Asia and in the US. So you can imagine that you might want to try to kind of like bias the system either way, depending on what you think your needs are. You know, favor SEP holders, people who do R&D for standardization, or you may want to favor the implementers. But, you know, these implementers, as well as R&D companies, are to a large extent, except for a couple of very important companies in Europe, they're outside of EU. And then, you know, if this system does work, however, so I'm not sure it will work, but if it does work, you can imagine that if you're in China, responsible for policy in China or India or in US or in Korea, that you might want to take back some of the sovereignty that you were taken away now. We heard that this system, FRAND patents, usually they're licensed at the worldwide level. So royalties are set at the worldwide level, and that might have that effect if it works. But then I can imagine that China, India, Korea, etc., and US are going to want to take this back. And now what you get is a fragmentation in the regulatory system, which is worse than what we've had before. Before, at least we had, procedures, due process in front of courts, certain degree of international committee, predictable environment. But now we might end up in something that is much more fragmented. So I don't see really a lot of potential in the direction of increasing sovereignty, and I see some risk of actually losing that. And then there's the thing that Colette mentioned earlier, that you can then imagine that stakeholders, for example, that are not happy with how the system is working, are actually taking their disputes to courts outside the EU. And that actually, limits the extent to which you have some degree of control over what's happening. But to add one point to Colette's, to the introductory statement, I join in most of the concerns that Colette and Patrick have raised. Perhaps a little bit less passionately. I'm not so deeply involved, but I join in them. But I add one thing that, there's this word transparency that's associated very much with this proposal. But we have to keep in mind that transparency in itself is not a legitimate goal. Economic efficiency is a legitimate goal. And even if you create some sort of transparency somewhere, if it's costly and doesn't serve the purpose, you haven't achieved your goal. And in this sense, I think that the instruments of this proposal, essentiality checks, royalty determination, and conciliation procedure are actually not really helping so much in terms of what economic efficiency dictates in relation to FRAND licensing, which is prompt negotiations, compensation that reflects the value in specific use of the patent portfolio in consideration, and then ultimately to exclude the value of standardization, because patent counting and aggregate royalty, some aggregate royalty, are not going to actually help us achieve these goals. But courts have made this clear, and I think are capable of resolving these issues, of taking them into account. And we see that it seems that it's working.
Thank you very much. So I know that the Science Business Network is largely made up of universities and researchers, and this is also a research story. So we've got someone here who commissions research on this and other topics, Axel from the 4IP Council, and I just wanted to say, the Commission cited 2 economic impact assessments here. But you've commissioned research on this topic as well. How would you say the evidence compares with what the Commission has gone and done with it?
Thank you, because that's a very good question. Overall, what 4IP Council is doing is we try to be proactive and commission research papers on anything related to IP. Now it's working? Okay. So everything that we do is really commissioning research papers on IP-related topics. And at the end of the day, I strongly believe that if you have to make a policy decision, it has to be based on empirical data, proof. And that's why I was so interested in the impact assessment that the European Commission has commissioned. First of all, what is interesting is in this report, they have been very, very good at finding data. So there is no question about this. But the only issue is it does not support what the European Commission is trying to do with the regulation. It doesn't support at all, actually. Because first, the good thing is to look at CEP litigation in Europe. And the impact assessment shows that it is decreasing. And there is no prevalence of CEP litigation. So the prevalence is low. That's not increasing, but we can even say that in 2021, they found only 3 litigations. So the question is there an issue here when you look at the numbers? Especially when at the top in 2014, they found 249. And now we are down at only 3. Then if you look at, is there any evidence that SEP owners are contributing less to stars development? No, there is no evidence. So the level of contribution stays the same. There is no evidence that implementers aren't choosing alternative standards. That's very important because it would have demonstrated that there was an issue in the market, and it is not the case. Then there is no indication that current SEP licensing conditions systematically depress or delay stars implementation. So it shows that the system is working. And I personally am active in starization, and I've seen a lot of SMEs actually contributing. So if it was blocking them, we would have known about it. And the empirical data shows that there is no issue. Another thing that is interesting is more what will be the economic impact. And in this impact assessment from the European Commission, it shows that how many standards will be caught into the net of this legislation. And what the researchers have found is 75,000 patent families. So one would wonder, that's a big number, but where is the issue? They also say that the minimum amount for assessing the essentiality of one patent will be around 5,000 euros. Okay. The reality is, I've done many in the past, experts are saying that it should be between 10,000 and 20,000 for one patent. So even at 4,000, then you do the math. That's a lot of money. And if then one should wonder in a laptop, and it is part of the impact assessment, in one laptop, there are at least 148 French standards implemented in only one laptop. So numbers are then growing so fast that at the end, from an economic perspective, it would have been good to have something justifying the choice of the European Commission, and it does not. What we have done at 4IP is last year we have commissioned a research dedicated to essentiality checks. Based on the European Commission study with the different scenarios, how essentiality checks could be done, and the pros and cons based on other research papers that we found, like AI, sample, full essentiality checks of every single patent, etc., etc. And the researcher that made this study at the end found that there was no solution that would provide real benefits, except that if you were checking every single patent declared as essential, which we know will be not possible, okay? So that's the first step. Transparency, nobody is going to say transparency is bad. I'm convinced of this. But how to reach full transparency, and is that possible already? And if there is a need, that should be demonstrated by a market failure. And even the documents provided by the European Commission show that there is no market failure. So today I'm in a phase where I'm trying to commission new research papers because maybe there is something that we have missed. But honestly speaking, we have not missed anything. Everything has been working for the last 25 years.
Thank you for sharing that. So Colette would like to say something.
I actually wanted to ask Axel a follow-up question, if that's okay. So Axel,
Yes, please.
you were talking about market failure and transparency. I go one step further, actually. I think as companies, we want to make our technologies accessible, one, for use, but two, also to try and demystify SEP licensing. It can be a complex topic. But when you were doing the research on essentiality checking, did you get the impression, because I know a lot of this package, or when I've been speaking to people in the Commission, they've said, well, a lot of it's driven by SMEs and implementations in new areas where there isn't the familiarity. But would just a simple outcome of essentiality be the kind of transparency that would help? You said that there wasn't a market failure, but what I'm also wondering is, when you're talking about whether this is beneficial, is it actually the type of transparency? Because when I read through the package, I read the measures, and the measures are very striking, as I said, and very onerous. But then there's this SME kind of assistance part of the package, but so little time seems to have been dedicated to that. And yet actually I would have thought that that could have been front and center of this package, if transparency is what it's about, because otherwise the measures such as frank royalty determination and aggregate royalty caps seem to me to be price control. So you're turning the Commission or the EU IPO into a price setting body rather than increasing transparency.
So just to cover the first part regarding SMEs, I just would like to highlight the fact that part of the impact assessment of the European Commission, only 3,192 SMEs being implementers have been surveyed, okay? And only actually, they got only 1.15% of response. So if it was really an issue, I expect that more SMEs would have answered. It was not required to be non-anonymous, okay? So even if you are afraid of saying something publicly, it was anonymous. So the SMEs would have been able just to say their thought and not being recognized. So the SMEs that have answered at the end, there was first a public consultation in February 2022. So we tried to look back as possible. And only 9 SMEs were able to provide some sort of evidence that were very light. Then in this impact assessment, only 37 SMEs. So it will demonstrate that this entire package that is supposed to really bring a disruptive change into the system may actually only cover 37 SMEs. And actually, when you look at what they said, they were not complaining about a broken system. So that's the first part. We, at 4IP, what we have done in 2022, we tried to do something similar, but the other way around. Is there maybe something that the SMEs are suffering that we have not identified? So we have commissioned a research, and the researcher went through talking to many SMEs. So do you have an issue with SEP licensing? And actually the answer was, by only a few, yes, we are starting to see an issue. So we're like, the researcher called me and said, wow, you found something. And then I asked the researcher, and he said, yeah, they are complaining that they are victims of holdout. So the SMEs were saying that it was not working because they were owners of SCPs and they could not get paid by the other companies. Nobody wanted to take a license from their SCPs. So it shows that the holdout issue was more an issue for the smaller companies than actually the SEP licensing regarding taking a SEP license from the big SEP holders. So it was a good demonstration at this time. Then regarding the aggregate rate, the aggregate royalty rate, we have just started looking at this issue because from a legal perspective, the question will be, is it correct that a body such as the EU IPO will set the price? Can we learn from the past, like for 2G, 3G? I remember there was a few attempts trying to set royalty aggregate rate, and it failed. Can we succeed now? So I would just recommend to wait a few months that we have the research, and then we'll see if indeed that could be possible, and that would be lawful.
Thank you for that, Axel. So I would like to just ask maybe some of the people who haven't haven't had anything to say yet. Maybe the two standards organizations. We're talking about standards already, and it's actually time we should move on to the second block, which is about the influence of this proposed regulation on standard making. So I found it fascinating what Axel just said, that the SMEs are actively involved in standards development. And I think, as several people have said now, that wasn't really something that the Commission really focused on very much in this regulation. So tell us a little bit from the perspective of ETSI, which actually produces these patents, or these standards, how you think of this regulation.
Okay, from an ETSI standpoint, it's a little bit different because we, as maybe you know, we are not involved in the licensing business. That's it's a fundamental principle. So on the aspect of transparency of the licensing, ETSI as an SDO has absolutely no comment on that. Where we have comment is regarding the, not transparency, I would call that, but the accuracy of the declarations of SEPs that have been made to ETSI. And here we are somehow disappointed that as a European standard organization recognized by the EC, we have absolutely not been involved in any of the projects of the Commission there. I mean, the Commission is the council, has a council role in ETSI, but when it came to the discussion about this regulations, we have not been involved. And one of the points which is very important is that we have a database that has been created. Well, the new version of the database has been created in 2011, and it's one of the major assets of ETSI. This database is recognized certainly as the most complete database regarding SEPs linked to connectivity in general. It seems that by this proposal of the Commission, they are totally disregarding all the work we have done, all the improvement we have done on the database, and all the improvement we can further do on this database. Secondly, I have the impression also that the Commission, or at least DG GROW, believes that this database is only fueled with SEPs coming from ETSI. No, it's not true. The major SEPs declaration are linked to 3GPP. What is 3GPP? 3GPP is the gathering of 7 other standard organizations across the world. It concerns the US, China, Korea, Japan, and India. And most of the technical specification of the G standards, I mean 5G today and 6G tomorrow and the other Gs, are coming, those technical specifications are coming from 3GPP. And what is the reaction of the non-European standard organization, meaning the 6 other standard organizations? I believe that their members will be very reluctant to declare their SEPs in a system that will be totally controlled by the European Commission. And I can tell you, because that is facts, that other of those organizations will be more than happy to take over the role of ETSI in regard to the development of the G connectivity and other connectivity standards. So there I see a tremendous risk that what could have been European standardization will go elsewhere and will be reduced to minor standardizations. Standardization may be requested by the Commission. I recap that the G standards have not been mandated by the Commission. It's the industry that has decided to invest, massively invest, and for taking 5G, for example, 5G is not falling from the skies. I mean, it's the origin of 5G can go back even to 2G, 3G, 4G, and all this has been only possible because the system was working previously. Tomorrow, if the system is changed, if the rules are changed, I have some doubt about the next G generations. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to mention is that I'm, as a secretariat here, I'm absolutely surprised by two events. The first one is this proposal of regulation coming here and now. And the second aspect, which is not known, but only by the ETSI members, is a strong will from the Commission to change the governance of ETSI. And this combination worries me quite a lot, because the idea of ETSI, which was a buttoned-up system, will be totally changed to a top-down system, and to what extent that will benefit of global standardization, I have some doubts about that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Ashoka Ganesh from Sensenelec, which is, as I understand it, less directly implicated in all of these things, but has issued at least one statement on the topic earlier in the process. I'd be curious to know what you think of the Commission regulation and subsequent comments.
Sure, thank you very much. In preparing for the session today, I wasn't really sure where to start. But I think I'm on the right track here. So first of all, just put ourselves on the same level with my colleague from ETSI. CEN and CENELEC and ETSI are the three recognised European standards organisations, recognised by Regulation 1025/2012. So between us, I think we cover all sectors of the economy for standardisation. I think apart from pharmaceuticals, I think that's the only thing that's outside our remit. So we cover everything that moves, everything that's produced, apart from pharmaceuticals, everything that flies, everything that's transmitted, I think. For us in CEN and CENELEC, exactly the same as ETSI, we're not involved in the licensing process. It's difficult enough running a system to make standards without interfering in things which are beyond our reach, beyond our capacity, beyond our knowledge. So we really, for us, patents, the links of patents and standards, essential patents is really very, very niche. I've been involved in standardization for 25 years. From the bottom up, I used to work at the British Standards Institution, the UK member of CEN and CENELEC, and was responsible for technical bodies making standards on materials. Some of them were cutting-edge materials, advanced ceramics, but there was no discussion about patents. Again, I've got a series of disclaimers here that I'll come to in a second. One of the disclaimers is my reality may not be the same as other people's realities, and I don't want to deny that reality. But strictly from my experience and the viewpoint of CEN CENELEC. So we have a policy. On standards and patents. I'll come on to my disclaimers. I did say in preparation, I told Brandon, I'm not an expert on patents and standards. So I'm speaking a bit outside my remit here. But it's okay, I'm learning a lot. It's not patents and standards are not an everyday discussion, and not an everyday dimension. It's not something that really worries us. It's not to say that it shouldn't. My role is Director of Market Perspectives and Innovation. Market Perspectives is the external cooperation aspects of CEN and CENELEC towards our partner standards bodies outside Europe. And I'd already decided to say today that, of course, that's nothing to do with patents, and I've just heard and understood that it actually is. So that's something I'd take away. Innovation, I was told, I became Director of Innovation for about, 8 years ago or something, and somebody wagged their finger at me and said, standards and patents today is not something for CEN CENELEC, but it will be in 2 or 3 years. I look back 80 years and there's still not much more discussion. Whether that's because we're fast asleep, whether because we've got our heads buried in the sand, I don't know. We grew up in Sen and Senelec in the 1960s, driven by the mining, iron and steel industries, transport railways, construction, so mechanical and civil engineering. It's not that there's no IP in those areas, but it certainly wasn't an issue that we had. But okay, I remember the days when I worked in Sen Management Centre in Brussels, and Senelec was across the other side of the street, and we didn't talk to each other, let alone talk to the colleagues down in Nice, in ETSI. The situation has evolved vastly, and we've now got a management centre in Brussels for the two organisations, Sen and Senelec. And I work alongside colleagues. There are 80 odd of us in the management centre, and I don't know, some of them have got Sen contracts, some Senelec contracts, and I've no idea who it is, because it doesn't matter, because we're dealing with the same topics: emerging technologies, cross-cutting technologies, technologies for interoperability, plus, yes, the old mining, construction, iron and steel, nuts and bolts, that's there still. But okay, we've had, forever as I can remember, we've had a patent policy. We have a guide, Senelec Guide 8, which lays out what that policy is. It's very niche, and we say, look, okay, when those conditions arise, this is how you should behave. Stakeholders who come to us and involve in the process, and you've got patented knowledge that you want to put in a standard, this is how you should behave. But we've got no control over the behavior. It's all advice, it's guidance. We're focusing on our standards being used, especially to bring product and systems and services to the market, so technology transfer. We have a separate Guide 39, which touches on, again, IPR. And of course, our policy is FRAND. We promote a FRAND approach to all patent licensing issues. So that's where we are. I've checked before coming our SEN database for SEPs, Standard Essential Patents, because of course we encourage declaration. And we have a few tens of standards. The latest, it is up to date because the latest was actually uploaded on the 23rd of March. So it is moving. I checked the ISO database, and of course from SEN we look up to ISO, and Senelec we look up to IEC, and I may be wrong, and I apologize if I've got this wrong, but I think the ISO database contains about 3,000 declared SEPs, and IEC, surprisingly, has actually got only about 1,000, unless I've read it wrong, which is perfectly possible, but that's sort of order of magnitude, and that's the situation we're in. We have given, as you said at the beginning, we have given an input comment into the regulation. I probably won't come on to that at this moment because I've spoken enough, but I can enlighten you on our views on that. But again, not to deny anybody else's reality, but this is our reality. And it's just, for us, it isn't an issue, despite all the predictions that it will become an issue. And I don't know, maybe it will be in 5 years' time, maybe it will be in 10 years' time. I don't know.
Well, I'd be curious, eventually, if anybody else around the table has an idea why that might be the case. Maybe, Dirk, we haven't come to you yet, or feel free to comment on anything else. And I'd also like to come back eventually to SMEs, because the Commission insisted this was all about SMEs and transparency. And what I've heard so far is most people can't think of any way in which that actually happens.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm, as you can see, from Nokia, but I'm coming from standardization. So I'm the head of standards policy in Nokia. And I have been working in standardization for more than 35 years. And I very well understand what you have been saying, that your realities are different to ours, because I have been doing mobile communication all over my business life. And for this part, so especially mobile communication, there is the fundamental difference to other industries. The communication industry, especially the mobile communication industry, is fundamentally based on standards, not in a way like other industries are using standards, so that you have a large areas of developing technology, proprietary technology, trying to protect this technology via via patents, using patents in an exclusionary way that nobody else can implement the technology. You'll have to look where are we coming from in mobile communication. And I mean, ETSI has been founded because of GSM. So a technology, a mobile communication system designed for supporting the European single market. And maybe I should say, of course, I'm not speaking for ETSI, but I'm the chair of the ETSI board. I have been chairing ETSI's IPR committee for 10 years, and I have been dealing with the interplay of patents and standards for a very long time. I have warned in the end of the 90s when we decided the technology for 3G, so this more or less outdated technology, which is now taken out of the market. At that time, we decided on the choice of the radio technology, and I have presented in that group in ETSI how dangerous this is, that when you would choose wideband CDMA, that one of the technologies there, because there are so many patents on that system where the alternative technology had a factor of 10 less patents. In that respect, I was wrong. It was nothing bad that there were so many patents. I had the same experience then for 4G or LTE, where before we started standardizing this technology, we had discussions and we were pushed by the mobile operators who have a very strong say in that ecosystem, where the manufacturers had as their customers the operators. So yeah, there is a very specific relationship between operators and manufacturers. And they were warning, some of these operators, I have to say, were warning if this goes ahead with all these patents, LTE will not fly because the licensing costs would be way too high. And they tried to push the industry to declare upfront their aggregated royalty rates and trying to force the patent holders to declare their maximum royalty they would charge. And what has happened? They didn't manage to get reasonable figures out. What happened then in that time? All the players on the handset side changed. So the champions which have been there, including my own company at that time, Nokia, but you can name it, Ericsson and Motorola and Alcatel and Sony, none of them are anymore there in this business. So if you identify, is there a monopoly of incumbents, that is usually then seen in an industry that these incumbents keep the market, protect their market power. None of that was there. So, and the use of this technology has exploded. You named the 5.4 billion users today. And despite all these patents, and yes, the number of standard essential patents have been increasing and increasing over the years, this industry has developed in an unforeseeable pace. And now we talk about 5G, and again, on 5G, there is no issue with patents. You know that there are very, very few percent for the of the turnover of the handset manufacturers going to their license into licensing costs. What I have told my colleagues in my role as chair of this ETSI IPR committee, where I always heard, you need to do something for IoT. IoT is a new world, and it's different from the big players fighting against each other or trying to negotiate licenses from big to big players. And I was pushing. You remember very well because I was talking to you and colleagues. you need to find ways and you need to manage to create ways to change the licensing to this different sector. And what happened? For example, Avanci was founded. And so the car industry had for 4G to pay, $15 at the beginning for such a license. And yet the car industry claims this is way too high, we don't want to take this license. So what I'm trying to put this into perspective, the Commission, which I have been discussing for many years, was also 10 years ago telling me, well, there is so much patent wars in the mobile industry that needs to stop. You need to change your system, otherwise we will regulate. I then always ask them, well, then tell me please and explain, what do you want to regulate? There was never any answer to that question. And, but there was a continuous willingness of the Commission services from the different parts of the Commission to discuss with ETSI. And Christian knows this very well. We had regularly meetings with Connect, with Grow, with Comp, with Trade. And yes, we have had an open discussion, putting all the facts on the table, and the result was there was no regulation. And there is a significant change now, because this file, as well as the standardization strategy file Christian mentioned earlier, which was communicated last year in February, was written exclusively by a rather small group of people in DG Grow, without a lot of consultation. And Commissioner Breton has been explaining topics which I would say are simply wrong facts when communicating the standardization strategy, unfortunately, but also now those who have seen and listened to the press release from Commissioner Breton when communicating this draft regulation, there have been many articles showing that he got the facts wrong. And of course he has been briefed in that way, it's not coming from himself. But therefore, this regulation, which is now interfering, as has been explained, so strongly and make a complete reset of the licensing for technology, which is so urgently needed, and I'm sure Krista will still talk about, when we heard it before, on cybersecurity, on AI, on all these topics. It is urgently needed that we create the standards there. And for 6G, which is currently going on in the parallel room, the discussion there, they fully rely on standards. And if in the regulation which comes out, which addresses the few remaining ICT champions which are European, if you look in the ICT world at large, you see that it's very few areas where we have European champions. They're not listening to the European champions, but then argue, well, this is good for you. We have heard argumentation from Commission people. You just do not understand how great this will be for you in the future. Sorry, I don't buy that, because the knowledge is not with some people in the European Commission. And so I think it will be very dangerous for standardization, as Christian has already explained. If this goes on, this regulation will not be drastically changed, but really will be implemented. It will reduce the ability of those who contribute today to standards. It will drive people away from the European standardization system, and we might even, together with the idea of digital sovereignty for Europe, and therefore that needs to be controlled by Europe, it will drive away from global standards. And this is a very concerning theme we hear now. I know I've talking too long, but thank you.
Actually, I do want to ask Krista one more question, but we've got a question out there, and Colette also wants to say. We've got just 15 or 20 minutes left, I think, before other people start coming here for their coffee break. Could I ask Krista one? So I would say for those who aren't following this file closely, it's not his fault. This was a DG Grow initiative. Krista works for DG Connect. But since I took a careful note in the opening plenary, you said you're also working on standards for cyber-secure devices. And I have to ask, are you worried by the things that you hear in this room then that not enough thought has gone into this proposal?
Let me say this. Many years ago, I was in DG Grow when it was called DG Enterprise. I'm glad it had a different name then, so I'm not connected with this initiative. What I'm hearing is alarming. It's eye-opening, and it's even more so disturbing, because I worked on 3G when we launched the 3G. I grew up with my late mother's NMT mobile phone, which weighed about 5-6 kilograms. It was placed on the footwell next to the driver in the car, because you couldn't actually have it in your pocket. It was just too big. So this was the NMT standard before the GSM came in, and then the 3G. At that time, I was in the Commission. I was looking at mobile communications, and our gadget mad commissioner, Erkki Liikanen from Finland, wanted to promote 3G and mobile phones, of course, with Nokia at home. And he set up something called the 3G Mobile Communications and Technology Platform. Nokia and Ericsson were invited at CEO level. Some satellite company CEOs like Eutelsat and Hispasat, SES Global, and a few content providers making up 12 major companies. They had an R&D budget at the time of 12 billion euros a year. This was just at the event when the euros were introduced. Anyway, and they said, well, if you have 1 billion euros to add into the pot, well, we'd be happy to take it along. But we already have the 12 billion. So they didn't really need the extra 1 billion. But anyway, that I think was a very good initiative. I was the secretariat running these, this platform, which ran over a year, trying to build up momentum around the launch of 3G. Anyway, having now followed into 5G and onto 6G, what I see now is, as an advice back to you, is to make sure that this proposal is blocked at council level. There are, ways of doing that. If you have sufficient number of member states blocking it, it will have to go back to the Commission to be revised completely. And I think there's so many arguments against this proposal, which validates that. Having said that, standards were given as a policy area to DG Grow many years ago, and it still is the fact. And it becomes even more complicated because DG Grow, DG Defis, which is defense industry and security, I think it's called, and DG Connect are all under Commissioner Breton and his responsibility, because they're all internal market policies. And I learned one thing early on in the Commission life, when I was asked to comment as a DG on a proposal coming from another DG, another Director General, and I said, no, I don't like this because it affects the SMEs negatively. And of course, DG Industry at the time, which was DG3, I was in DG23. These all ended up in DG Enterprise later on. But anyway, so I said no. And then I got a call from the Cabinet saying, you can't say no because it's your Commissioner's proposal from the other DG. And he was in charge of DG Industry as well as DG23, DG23. So I had to revise my answer. And I said, well, I'm still not liking it. Well, you have to like it, whether you like it or not. So I had to revise my, answer. This was done through somebody else and then signed off behind my back. So it actually went up. So it's similar here. If DG Connect, which is in charge of all these, ETSI standards, and Nokia, Ericsson, of course, being our, companies under our tutelage, under our, sphere of things. If they are now negative, well, if they're negative on this and we're not, let's say, commenting on it because DG GROW is in charge and we cannot actually intervene with what DG GROW in charge of standards are saying, then we are really stuck for an answer. But my advice as, well, having worked as an advisor to the president a long time ago, is to go back and say, no, this cannot go through because there are just too many objections. If 37 companies, be it SMEs, are answering to this, and we know that 98-99% of all the companies in Europe are SMEs or micro companies, even smaller, and they are in the startup phase, and they are, let's say, the innovative spearhead, together with, of course, major investments from the stakeholders at the table. Then we cannot actually base any opinion based on those few inputs. When I was in DG Enterprise, we had something called Business Impact Assessment. It was a questionnaire with 6 questions. You filled it out in about 5 minutes. One question was, does it affect SMEs? Yes or no? End of story. Next. And it just went through like that. And we realized that that business impact assessment was null and void. We cannot just have that. We need to build on OECD guidelines, which had a regulatory impact analysis, which was based on a cost-benefit analysis. What does it cost? What are the benefits? And build in a lot of more questions, a lot more in-depth questions. And I think we've actually lost that in this regulation. I'm glad I'm in DG Connect, as I said, and nobody in my hierarchy can do anything about me because I'm soon to retire anyway. So if they start a procedure, it will take 3 years. Trust me. And they won't give me 3 more years in the commission. I'm happy with that. But I think you need to speak your mind. Otherwise, you're up the creek without a paddle. That gives you 2 expressions in one. I'll stop there. But I'm happy to discuss this further with anyone in the coffee break later.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sure. We had a question over here. You had your hand up a while. Maybe just come and join us at the table, push the button, and say who you are at the beginning. Thanks. And if anybody else has no, not to speak, only to hear.
It's okay now?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm an outsider. I'm from Canada, so I have a question I'd like to ask you guys, so just bear with me. So, as you know, in Canada, we have the Standards Council of Canada. So what I'd like to know at this point, because if you look at all those value chains, ICT-related value chains, they are international, as you guys mentioned earlier on. So what's the situation right now at the international level? Are there being discussions between those different bodies that are responsible for the management of standards in every country? So what's the situation right now, and what will be the impact at the end of the day? If you had a crystal ball, what do you think will happen?
Who is this a question to? Whoever wants to answer. Okay. Dirk.
I can give a few answers. I mean, we had a global standards collaboration meeting a month ago, and in the past, Industry Canada was part of the GSC. They resigned, but it's ISO IEC and ITU and all the 3GPP partner organizations, and we issued a press release about the importance of the value of global standards collaborating. And as I have said, I see this whole concept of global standards clearly at risk. And if I give a second answer to your question, when this draft regulation was coming out, I think it was without precedence that 4 previous leaders of US agencies, from the Attorney General of the DOJ to the former NIST president, they all clearly condemned what was coming out here as the draft regulation, and you heard now from the US Secretary of Trade, I think, you can, that they were very, very concerned now and told this to von der Leyen, seeing that this attempt to dictate globally the prices for the global patent licenses, because this is portfolio. We talk about global, worldwide portfolio licenses, and saying that one country, one region is now stepping up and say, I will now tell you what this is completely against an idea of a global...
Doing things globally, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, would anybody else like to comment on that? Or
I was going to...
I would say too that at some point soon people may start coming for the coffee break. So at that time, I think we will just abruptly call this session to an end.
Okay.
And we can continue the conversation over coffee.
I was
Colette.
just going to actually add a bit more flavour to the answer to that question, which is, yes, we have seen officials and former and current officials from other jurisdictions raising concerns about the implications of this package to global standards, and certainly Europe's role in global standards. In ETSI, we have a standards body that has taken a leading role with 3GPP. And I see other members of 3GPP probably snapping at their heels and thinking, well, how could this benefit them? From a company perspective, there is a disconnect within this regulation. It looks at European patents, but it recognizes that companies such as ours license their global portfolios. And they do so for efficiency, but they also do so because licensees want licenses that allow them to freedom to operate globally, to expand. If we're looking at small companies, then they want to be able to expand their business. And so there is global licensing, there are global standards, and yet Europe is introducing something that I think risks leadership and risks engagement. I was also alarmed during the press conference. One of the members of the press asked Commissioner Breton whether other jurisdictions should see this as an example that they should be introducing equivalence. And he actually embraced this and actively encouraged it. And again, I'm concerned that when you look at, as a company, we're looking at what would be the risks if there were fragmentation. We're already looking at what could be the risks. There are geopolitical concerns that we're all aware of, and we're looking at these things. But if you have a package that's been introduced this way, and my other comment, and why I had my hand up earlier, is you've heard people around this table saying, well, we weren't consulted. To be clear, there was a commission consultation process. There was a call for evidence in the generalist of terms. There was a 1.5-page summary of where this might come out. There was also a questionnaire. What I see in the draft regulation as was published, and indeed in the leaked drafts before that, is far removed from those questions. There are things that are covered that were never discussed with us. As one of the European leading contributors to open standards, but also as a major licensee, a major licensor, we want standardized technologies to be successful. We want them to be adopted. We wanted to engage constructively, but because the final draft of this proposal as published didn't have that kind of dialogue, that input, as Patrick Hofkins was saying earlier, these standards and the system that's in place today has developed over decades with industry initiative, with engagement. And so I appreciate you saying we should go and we should speak more and express our views, but we do hope that they'd be heard. And dialogues like this are very important to that. So I just wanted to say thank you as well to you, Brandon, for chairing this, because I do think that this is the start of a discussion rather than the end of it.
So thank you very much, Colette. So until, is it, I can't see behind me, are there? We need to wrap up. If anybody would like to make any very last, very quick statement, you could have 1 minute.
Just quickly on SMEs, because you asked a question on SMEs, just very, very quickly. Two things. One, SMEs benefit from a good working standardization system because it gives them the shoulders to stand upon to innovate. So that's super important that the system continues to work. And the more we have European contributors to the standardization, the better it is for SMEs. Second point, we don't like this regulation as licensees. Why? We're a big licensee, Ericsson, a huge licensee. We're a big contributor, but we're a big licensee. Why? Because of the quality questions that I raised. So for SMEs, if you have a system that is not based on good quality, on good, minimum quality levels, how is that going to be good? So it's a system that may benefit the bad faith players, actually. One example, if you are one with only 5 to 6 or 7 small company with a few number of patents, you don't need to go under scrutiny. You don't need to do an essentiality assessment. That sounds great. Imagine now that you have players that are divesting their portfolios to small companies because they don't go under scrutiny. How do you work with that? So is this not a system that may create actually NPE activity that is very bad? And so it's all these small things that require thorough thinking before implementing this massive regulation, and that has not happened. So it really needs to be revisited so that it does what it needs to, i.e. having a better system. And for SMEs specifically, I think the first thing is information. If an SME knows that you need to go to court, you need to prove everything before you can actually get a license in place, that's already a big thing. And it's as simple as that sometimes.
Just another comment on SMEs. If SMEs are really concerned, then it's not those who want to license, but who are the licensors, who contribute their technology, and who are nowadays faced already with a small company asking a very big company to take a license, and they simply laugh and say, well, just sue me. And so there is, it's much bigger, a much bigger problem for an SME licensor than for an SME licensee.
Thank you very much.
Very quick comment about disputes and so on. It appears that WIPO, in the mediation center of WIPO, is seeing more and more cases coming to them, and obviously are successful. So the idea of what's going to happen in Alicante, despite the fact that UPC Mediation Center will also be questionable, it exists, it already exists, that you have a possibility to mitigate your disputes, at least at a higher level, which is the WIPO level.
Thank you very much. So I think with that, we're going to call this, we'll call it a wrap. I think to Colette's point, this is the start of a discussion which may be with us for the next 2 years or so. Thank you all for the active participation.